After a 6-week hiatus from the gospel tradition of St. Mark, we return to Mark's gospel, as you know, and for the rest of this year, we'll be considering passages from his gospel as the lead for our reflection. So this being the 22nd Sunday of the church year, the readings are, the first reading comes from the book of Deuteronomy, the 4th chapter, verses 1 and 2, and then verses 6 and 8. We're going to begin in the second reading, the letter of James. Won't speak too much of it today, but James's letter will be with us for the next few weeks. So it begins, chapter 1, verses 17 and 18, verses 21b to 22, and verses 27. So right away, even as the letter of James begins, we do a little bit of editing for some of his thoughts. As we will see, this letter turns out to be one of the more discussed letters of the New Testament and one of the more practical. And finally, the gospel selection comes from Mark's Gospel, chapter 7, verses 1 through 8, then verses 14 and 15, and then verses 21 and 23. So again, we're doing a little bit of editing as we return now to the Gospel of Mark. We ended, one remembers, as I say, some 7 weeks ago, with Mark's 6th chapter, appropriately. We need to see that what happened after what we heard 6 weeks ago was that Mark then includes a story, namely in verses 30 through 44, of feeding the 5,000, and then in verses 45 to 52, Jesus walking on the waters, where he astounds his disciples. Now, when you think about it, one of those particular events we substituted with the story found in John's Gospel. So kind of John's Gospel picked up right where Mark's story would have talked about the feeding of the 5,000. What was a little interesting in the story of Jesus walking on the waters when the wind was blowing, that he was pictured in Mark as going to walk by his disciples. His disciples called out. They were astounded to see him walking on the waters at the 4th watch of the night. Now you remember that time was divided in the first century world according to quarters. So there were 4 quarters to night, 4 quarters to day. So the 4th quarter of the night would have been 3 to 6 o'clock in the morning, when Jesus, in Mark's story, is pictured as getting into the boat with the disciples. Then he thought that it would be important for them, again, to spend a little bit of time together. Chapter 6 of Mark's story ends with verses 53 to 56, which is a summary of what Jesus had been doing, particularly emphasizing, as Mark's story is concerned with these things, as bringing healing to people. In fact, Jesus is pictured as staying at one place, and that people were bringing to him on mats many of the sick persons. In fact, they were called straw mats. Well, what did you think mats were made of? But they were multi-purposed mats because, and that's why they were particularly connected with the poor, served as their beds. So it wasn't just that. And so when at one point Jesus says, "Take up your mat and walk," well, he's really taking, yes, his bed, but if you think about it, really his whole house. That's really all he had to his name. So Mark's story concludes by seeing Jesus as being in the center of a village or a city. Of course, be careful that cities are not the sizes that we think, or even hamlets. The center of the city was known as the agora, the marketplace, obviously where people came, marketplace of the city, to exchange not only goods, namely whatever they had grown, but also ideas. So the agora, the center, really is the place where Mark finds Jesus settled in the Galilee. As we mentioned earlier on, the Galilee in the first century world was rather heavily populated. So although it's a small territory in many ways, there were a number of villages and hamlets that were found in that area, and often they would only be a few miles apart from one another. So there was also a kind of link of activities that took place from these various towns. So all of that kind of leads up now to chapter 7. Chapter 7 begins a very serious and interesting conflict stories. Now, one of the characteristics of Mark's story is Jesus frequently finds himself in conflict with the authorities. In fact, this had happened earlier on. One needs only to go to chapters 1 and 2 of Mark's story to see that already he was being challenged. But as chapter 7 begins, there are a number of Pharisees and some scribes who come up from Jerusalem to challenge Jesus. And most of the time in this gospel, and I mentioned that we have to be careful, this isn't the whole of the Pharisees, but some of the Pharisees. And Jerusalem Pharisees would be those who were in some ways connected with the sacrificial activities that took place there in the holy city, who challenged Jesus on points of his teaching. And most often in conflict stories, Jesus does come out ahead, but not always. And important to notice that these leaders come from Jerusalem. Already in Mark's story, a kind of admonition that Jesus himself will end up in Jerusalem, and therefore a premonition of his coming death, passion and death. So as the episode begins, that there are some of his disciples who are eating without washing their hands. Now, this is, we might smile at this, and some might say, it sounds just like my parents used to say to me before you came to supper at night. What was one of the questions that Mom often asked, did you wash your hands? Because there was a health reason for washing one's hands. That, however, is not the primary point of washing hands in the episode that we're looking at. It had to do with ritual, with purity codes as they were noticed, okay? And as we have mentioned before, just kind of quick review, we do believe that the gospel tradition, according to Mark, seemed as a primary audience. Yes, some who were coming over from the Hebrew community, but also we're speaking to many sisters and brothers who had not grown up in Judaism, who therefore would be classified as the Gentiles, who are part of Mark's community and therefore are listening to and receiving the message that this gospel is presenting to them. It begins by saying that some of his disciples were eating loaves, so not all of them. You know, we always have to be careful that we don't make all inclusive, although Mark at times has that idea when he uses the word all or every. He doesn't leave much room for development, does it, or change. But in this case, the word some is used. Now, this idea of washing hands before offering ritual sacrifice is not particularly testified to in the Old Testament. At least this custom we don't find there. although by Jesus' time it does seem that it had been common or become common in some quarters. Now, once again, notice where the Pharisees come from. They come from Jerusalem, where the custom, particularly because the priests and those who offered sacrifice would be found, of washing hands before entering into some kind of sacrificial oblation did take place. So the gospel writer here, and this now goes to my point, says all Jews followed this custom. Well, that's not true. There were some Jews who followed this custom. And in fact, as we have mentioned before, and it's important perhaps once again, as we are going to pay attention more regularly to Mark's story, to recognize that there was not a universalness among Jews in Jesus' time. In Jesus' time, there was a great diversity of understandings of what believing in the message that Moses had given from Sinai, well, not in believing it, but how it was to be exercised and how it was to be lived out. That's why we have groups like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, the scribes, each in their own way, and we have just their take on things, understood how Jewish life should be lived and practices that should be followed. The discovery, you remember, down at Qumran of the Dead Sea Scrolls indicates that there was a community there, later identified as the Essenes, who also had their take on how Jewish customs and practices should be carried out. So again, I review all of this because as Jesus' disciples are now taken to task by these critics who come from Jerusalem, Jesus responds by saying that, and this purification rite, by the way, was apparently very elaborate. In fact, in the text of this week, says that they would purify their hands up to the wrist. Now, the translation that we have decides that it'll leave that little part out, but sometimes it's interesting to notice what is included and how. So how did one wash one's hands up to one's wrist? And then some say, well, the way in which you did it was by clubbing your hand like this. Well, kind of, see, so it was a scrubber. Those of you who use those things at home. So a lot of the practice, you see, was known to those who followed in this tradition. So washing the hands, some said to the elbow. Well, now that meant that you really had to go way up here. All of this is ritual purity, okay? As I say, it's not obviously you used water to do it, but it is obviously not about health reasons or sanitation reasons that this practice was being done. So the critics say to Jesus, why do your disciples not follow the custom? And Jesus, in verse 6 of a chapter that we're looking at, quotes the prophet Isaiah by saying, this people loves to follow customs that are external, but internally they do not seem to really follow through. So Jesus now takes on his critics as regard to this custom. Isaiah said, this community honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Well, you can imagine that Jesus' contemporaries were not too happy when he kind of threw this at them. Now, verses 9 through 13 are excluded. And what is there, so let me just mention this, is a little phrase where Jesus is now going after his critics and saying, oh, you talk about being caring and careful for everything. But there is this custom that you have also developed, and it was not a custom that's mentioned in the Old Testament, but was certainly used by many Jews, a custom known as korban. Korban really is a Hebrew word for gift, which said, and it had to do with care for one's parents, that he says, what you guys do, and again, when you say you, all, be careful, obviously not all the Jews did this, is rather than help your parents who needed help in their struggles with life, say to your parents, sorry, but we have given it as korban, as gift to the temple. Therefore, this money that we might have used to help you, we can't do. Now, Jesus says, isn't that a bit hypocritical? The Jews who claim to follow so well the laws and customs support this kind of practice. Now, it's not in our reading this week, and that's kind of left out because I suppose we say, well, it does portray a kind of bad light on the Jews. And again, I've mentioned this many times in our talk. Keep in mind that these are only some of the Jews. It's not an attack against Judaism, it's an attack against some practices that some Jews followed or didn't follow. And unfortunately, often, we've mentioned this in the past, has not been recognized. And so when you mention the Jewish custom of everybody washes their hands, see how hypocritical that is. Well, again, that is really not correct and really pushing it a little bit too far. So what we know here, and maybe this is an opportunity to kind of just review here, that what we're talking about, by the way, are Jewish Christians and Gentile converts. And what we know in the time in which Mark is writing his story is that there were 4 positions that were taken in regard to certain customs and practices that were coming over from Judaism. One group were Jewish Christians and Gentile converts who insisted on the observance of all the prescriptions of the Mosaic law, including circumcision of males. So that, and where we know something about this is from some letters of Paul, which were written earlier than Mark's story. So there were a group of Christians who held this, and you can see a very strong affinity with Jewish customs. There was a second group of Jewish Christians and their Gentile converts who did not insist on male circumcision, but did require converted Gentiles to keep some Jewish observances. These, I suppose we would call, were moderately conservative Jewish Gentile church, and so that was another segment. My point that I'm developing here is, even among Christians in the first few decades of our Christian experience, did not do things or think things in exactly the same way. The third group were Jewish Christians and their Gentile converts who did not insist on male circumcision and did not require observance of Jewish kosher laws. So they said, you don't need to do any of this. We're doing things differently. And that's the way we should move forward. And finally, there were Jewish Christians and other Gentile converts who did not insist on male circumcision or other Jewish ritual laws, and who saw no abiding significance in Jewish cults or feasts. So they are, I suppose we would say, rather radical in the position that they argued there should be no connection now between the way in which the Hebrew community, Jewish community, observe things and the way in which we as Christians are going to observe things. In some ways, perhaps it's that fourth position that catches on unfortunately, in some ways, over the next centuries as we move forward. But my point of just reviewing this is that there is not universality here about the relationship between Jewish customs and practices and our early Christian sisters and brothers. Now, all of this develops within the first 4 to 5 decades of the Christian experience, remembering that Mark is writing his gospel around the year 70, so maybe 40 years or so, certainly after Jesus' time. Now, picking up on what Jesus has to say in this section, he argues, and of course there's a certain very real wisdom here, he argues that it isn't so much what goes into a person, but what comes out of a person that distinguishes and designates what is good or not good. Now, in another section which is left out, as I mentioned, there's a little bit of editing that goes on. Jesus is pictured as saying, what goes into a person does not go to their heart. And remember, in Old Testament thinking, that the heart is the center of the person, that it is not only the physical center, but it's also the center from which the emotions, the feelings, thinking comes from. So what Jesus says is, what one takes in doesn't go to the heart, but it goes to the stomach. And after it has had its time in the stomach, it goes to the latrine. Now, for those of you, that's a nice way of saying it comes out at the other end. And therefore, does not seriously really affect a person. It might have its beneficial needs as far as nutrition goes, but it comes in and it goes out. And that is not what makes a man clean and unclean. Now, what we're talking about here, of course, is the Jewish sense that there were certain foods which were understood to be clean and other foods which were understood to be unclean. This did, when we look at some of the practices of Judaism, did see that it had some health understandings. So, for example, and I think we mentioned this before, that, for example, Judaism argues against eating pork. Well, keep in mind that in the Middle East, it's rather warm a lot of the time, that you don't have refrigeration, and that pork tends to turn rancid much more quickly than other foods. And so for that reason, they said, don't eat anything that has to do with pork. They were declared to be unclean. Now you see, we might lose sense of the practicality that lie behind some of the customs that were developed by Judaism. If you let some meat out in the hot sun, particularly at this season of the year, you might be a little cautious about whether you would find it edible or whether it was already beginning to turn rancid. So you see, that was one of the practical reasons for some of the customs that Jews developed, and therefore they declared pork or pigs unclean, in the sense now it took on not only a health concern, but it also took on a ritual understanding. Now, in verses 16 through 20, which again is left out in this section, the disciples are pictured as talking with Jesus, and he kind of, as typically he does in this gospel, says, "Are you guys still so obtuse? Can't you kind of figure it out about the food, where it goes, how it comes out, what it's all about?" Well, he makes that claim. And then as verse 21 picks up, we now have a new audience, by the way. It seems that Mark has shifted a little bit. And it is here that Jesus reiterates what he has been suggesting. Remember, his opponents are coming after him about not washing their hands, and he is trying to really illustrate a much deeper kind of thing. He says, if you think about it, it's not what goes in, but what comes out of a person that tells us a lot. And what comes out of a person, and here Mark pictures Jesus as saying, from the human heart come evil designs, and lists that there are 12 vices. 6 of them are plural, 6 of them are singular. And what are these vices? Well, we'll hear them all kind of nicely listed in the reading. Evil designs, sexual immoralities, thefts, murders, adulteries, forms of greed, malicious acts, deceit, promiscuity, the evil eye, blasphemy, arrogance, and folly. Now, be a little careful here with the idea of the evil eye. That's not what people think of it as today. It simply meant that one was looking at some things in the wrong way, and therefore that would be wrong. So, as a retaliation to his critics, Jesus says, listen, what's clean and unclean is not necessarily just about food customs. But it's important to see that Jesus is not pictured as rejecting these practices, okay? That sometimes is also the way in which, unfortunately, Jesus has been portrayed, as rejecting Jewish customs and practices. That's not what this debate is all about, but it's about Jesus' teachings reaching a deeper level for his audience, or audiences, depending on which one you're looking at, and for his critics. So you see here again a great deal of what we remember about the wisdom tradition, and Jesus speaks what everyone knew, the vices. But wouldn't it be better if one remembered that out of the human heart, out of the human person, comes good things and the ability truly to, if you want, purify the worlds that one was a part of, not by something that was negative and ill-defining, but something that was helpful and supportive. So all of that today hoped a little bit to remind us that in Jesus' time there was a great diversity of Judaisms, by the way, and a great diversity among Christians in these first times. And so the caution, if there's a kind of thought that I'm suggesting today, is be careful. We need to be careful, and we're much more aware of this certainly when we look at the stories in the Old and New Testament of diversification. There were things in which they all agreed upon, but things in which, again, there was diversity. I would like to conclude with just a point from the second letter to first letter of James here, where he has a couple of remarks. James, we will see as we move through these talks, was very practical. In fact, so practical that some Christians thought maybe we don't want to hear him. But he says a couple of things here that might be worth looking at as we hear the readings this week. Number one, James defines religion as pure and undefiled before God and before the Father. And he says this is what religion is: to care for orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. So there's a kind of practical thought here that James has. The other thought that you'll hear in this reading, James says, be doers of the word, not hearers only, deluding ourselves. So what will one find in this gospel of letter of James are very practical thoughts on many different aspects, not only of leading the Christian life, but also of leading life in general. This letter attributed to James, we're not quite sure who the author was. Could have been one of the 12, remember, James and John. He could have been the leader of the community at Jerusalem named James, who ultimately was martyred. It may be all of these or one of these. But anyway, it's a very interesting letter, and encourage us as we move along to listen to this. I did not have too much time this week to talk about Deuteronomy, but we have talked about that work in the past. So may we be always, with the gifts that we have, the talents that we use, make things truly, if we can use this imagery from the scripture, clean in the way that it is creatively good for all that we, in all that we do, and for all that we come in contact with. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.